Hey, Julie, I can see you, but it shows that you're connecting. Okay, now there's a check, and you can unmute yourself on the bottom left. I see Javi Weisberger is joining. Perfect, connecting. Julie, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Okay. Before you were unmuted. So it's a good idea, actually, that when someone is not talking, to maybe keep themselves muted just in case there's background noise, but be very prepared to jump on and unmute yourself when I ask a question. Let me message Beatrice to make sure she is ready.
She just joined us, Naftali.
Oh, perfect. So that's unnecessary. Let me go ahead and do live on Facebook. And the page you manage, Yaffed.
Woo.
Is everything okay?
Huh?
Okay, we're live on Facebook. So, and we're also live here. So just making sure you're all aware. We're gonna wait a few minutes and we're only gonna start at about 12:03. We'll actually make the introductions and everything because I'm assuming people will be trickling in, okay?
Naftali, just while I'm thinking of it, a couple of people asked me if there was going to be a recording. Is that? Yes. Okay.
Yes, we're recording. Okay, so just so you know, we already have a pretty large number of participants. It's at 38 and climbing. But we're still going to wait another few minutes because people are still going to be trickling in. Don't worry, we're not going to go later than 1 or 1:15, including Q&A. Hey all, I just want to let you know again that we will start in 2 minutes. So the silence is not because there's something wrong with the audio. We're just waiting for a few more people to trickle in. And we will begin very shortly. 2 more minutes at 12:03. we will officially begin. Okay, in a few more seconds, we will officially begin. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for being here. My name is Naftali Moster, and I'm the Executive Director of Yaffed, Young Advocates for Fair Education. We are a nonprofit organization working to improve secular education in ultra-Orthodox and Hasidic Yeshivas. Many of you are already familiar with the issue in general, but as this coronavirus crisis has been dragging on and taking up everyone's attention and shifting priorities on the part of policymakers and the media, we recognize the need to keep this issue alive and on people's radar so that as soon as things improve and go back to normal or somewhat normal, we can continue making the progress towards improvement. So in the coming weeks, we'll be doing some webinars discussing our issue from various angles and perspectives and with new, fresh voices. And we hope that you'll join us and invite your friends and colleagues as well. So I want to begin by welcoming our panelists, Javi Weisberger, Beatrice Weber, and Julie Kay. And I will ask them each to introduce themselves, and I'll begin with Javi.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Javi Weisberger. I'm the Director of Community Engagement at Footsteps, a nonprofit that helps folks who are transitioning from an ultra-Orthodox lifestyle to a life of their choosing. Personally, I am the mother of 3 children, and after getting divorced from my Hasidic ex-husband, I spent 5 years fighting for custody of my children, ultimately appealing a bad decision and winning back custody of my children who still are required to attend Hasidic Yeshivas. So I'm going to be speaking about from that perspective. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Javi. Now, Beatrice.
Hi, I'm Beatrice Weber. So good to be here with all of you. I'm a mother of 10 children, all of them raised in the Hasidic community up in Rockland County and here in Brooklyn. 6 of them are boys. And I'm going to be talking a little bit about my perspective. They've all attended Hasidic Yeshivas in the community. And I recently filed a lawsuit against my youngest son, my 7-year-old son's Yeshiva, and the Department of Education because he is not receiving an equivalent education. And I think we'll be talking about that further.
Thank you, Beatrice. And now, Julie.
Thank you, Naftali, and I'm glad to be here as well. I appreciate everybody tuning in. I'm a lawyer with a background and expertise in gender equity, religious freedom, and preventing family violence. And I launched an initiative with Footsteps a couple of years ago to protect the parenting rights of people who are leaving the ultra-Orthodox community. And on a more personal background level, I was raised very Reformed Jewish outside of Boston in a community that really valued education and social justice. And so I've welcomed the opportunity to connect with Yaffed and to be on this panel today.
Great, thank you, Julie, and thank you all for the introductions. So I'm gonna jump right in. I'll ask Javi and Beatrice first to tell me about the education your children, particularly your sons, receive in their yeshivas. And after you tell us about what their education looks like in general during normal times, If you could also tell us a little bit about how they transitioned to remote learning during this crisis. So Beatrice, you can go first.
Okay, so I think I'll focus on my youngest son with a little bit of perspective in regards to my older children. So as I mentioned before, I'm a mother of 10 children, 6 of them boys. And, you know, as I mentioned before, I recently took active action to see what I can do to change my 7-year-old son education, because knowing of the limited education that my older boys received. In general, and they've, again, 6 of them in different counties. So they've been to several Hasidic and ultra-Orthodox schools, and consistently throughout all of them, there was a maximum of 90 minutes a day devoted to anything related to secular studies, which included, you know, math, reading, or anything else that may have been included there. This goes on for about 5 years, between the ages of 7 and 13. And I think what's important and what's becoming more and more astounding to me is the teachers themselves have gone through a similar education system. So they're really learning from people that don't even have the basics in terms of don't even have a high school education. I'll just mention something. My son's learning how to read, and I've taught him how to read, so he knows how to read. So he said to me, "Mommy, I'm learning how to read, but don't get upset because I'll be saying things differently. I know you're supposed to say the, but now my teacher told me to say duh." So, you know, it's really kind of the blind leading the blind in that way. So recently the schools closed down, as all the schools did. And so the method that they're using now.
Yes? Before you continue, can you also take us through a regular day? Like, your son attends, goes to Yeshiva, he shows up there. What does his day look like? Can you take us through the day?
Sure, I can get more specific about that. So his day starts at 8, or did, okay, everything here is past.
You get that, you're cutting out.
No, but started at 8, so I put him on the bus at 8. Ooh. Okay, am I better now? I moved. Can you hear me now? Okay, so his day started at 8. Okay, he'd get to school about 8:35, and from 8:35 till 3:45, he had a combination of prayers, Judaic study, lunch, you know, recess, and all of that. So the bulk of the day is devoted to, you know, their Judaic study learning when they're younger. I'm sorry, they're drilling upstairs. I hope it's not interfering with the noise. When they're younger, they focus on, you know, different texts. As they get older, they focus more and more on the Talmud. And that's what the focus is until 3:45. At that point, they break and they switch. So the 5th grade Judaic study teacher becomes the 2nd grade secular studies teacher, okay, and teaches them whatever they learn during those, you know, during those under 90 minutes, because it's like about an hour and a quarter. I met with the teacher. He's very proud of himself. He's very proud that he's done this for so many years. You know, and when I met them, they were, you know, reciting the alphabet and kind of the sounds around it. I've never gotten a curriculum, despite my repeated requests for a curriculum or goals or a report card. I've never gotten anything more than a general, you know, this is when we start, this is when we end. And I have tried, but I haven't gotten anything more than that. So I can't go specifically into what exactly happens during that hour, you know, and 15 minutes of actual learning. I can't go into that.
Great. Now, so what does this education look like right now during this coronavirus?
Okay, so what they've done, it took them a little bit to figure it out. They have a phone number that the children call in. The beginning, they were doing it for about an hour and a half of a stretch of time. They broke it up now to 2 separate 1-hour periods of time where they call up and all the kids are on the phone, and, you know, their Judaic studies teacher is speaking to them. At this point, there has been no mention, or there doesn't seem to be that there'll be any secular studies happening during this time. Unfortunately, my experience has been is that when there's something going on, a holiday or anything else, like that's kind of the first thing that goes. So I haven't heard of that they're going to be including any secular studies during this time. It remains to be seen what will happen. But thus far, the focus has been, again, on the Judaic studies during that 2 hours on the phone. And it's a challenging time, I think, for everybody. So they're all trying to figure it out.
Okay, thank you, Beatrice. Now, Javi, can you tell us about your children's education?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I have 3 children. I'm going to be speaking about my son's education. He's in 9th grade this year. On a regular school day, he leaves the house at 7 o'clock in the morning. Shacharis is at 7:30, that's the morning prayers. And he returns home from school at 7:45 p.m. My apologies, 8:45 p.m. And so he's out of the house for about 13 hours a day. 1.5 hours of that time is devoted to secular studies. I'm lucky because my son's Yeshiva, which is an ultra-Orthodox school, actually prepares the children to take regents. And that's supposed to happen. The 2 regent subjects are being taught within 1.5 hours of the school day. And this is at the very end of the day after a full long day of Talmud studies, very rigid, rigorous Talmud studies. So it's not like they have a lot of different subjects that they're going through in the course of the day. It's just stretches of time of Talmud study. And then at the end of it, 1.5 hours of math and global studies to prepare them for the regent. Something that I wanted to share with everybody too is that last year when my son was in 8th grade, his school actually sent home a class schedule, which, as Beatrice mentioned, is unusual because the schools generally don't provide a schedule or a curriculum or report cards or anything like that. It's been really difficult understanding what they're doing during the course of their day. All I had to go on was the reports that my son brought home to me. But last year, his teacher generously provided a schedule, and I'm going to share the screen. I see Josh has a question about whether my son's school is a Hasidic school. Yes, it is. He's in an ultra-Orthodox Hasidic school. I'm going to share my screen with you all. Let's see if I can do this well. Here it is. Does everybody see that now, or?
Yes,
Yeah.
we should all be seeing it, yes.
Okay, so this is what the 8th grade in my son's Hasidic Yeshiva provided as a schedule last year. And if you, as you can see, they had under 1 hour of secular studies per day from 2:30 until 3:22. And on a regular day like Monday, it was bell work, history. It says in Hebrew Chazara, which means review, geography, and then pack up. And then at that point, they just went back to Talmud studies for the rest of their school day. So this is an 8th grade in the Hasidic Yeshiva, and this is what their curriculum looked like. I will report, though, that they actually didn't even do this much in their classroom every day. Very quickly after the first month, the first month of the school year, they reverted to just doing Talmud studies all day. And during their hour of secular study, they would just study the Talmud and translate it into English. I'm going to stop this share.
So can I ask you something though?
Yeah.
You were saying now that he's in 9th grade, right? They're preparing him for the regents. Are they taking this as serious as they did that, or are they taking it more serious somehow?
So they are trying to get the kids to be prepared for the regents, but I think, you've done such a good job, Naftali, of talking about this over and over in past conversations with Yaffed. The children are being trained to see secular studies as inferior and as not important. And so in my son's classroom, it's like 25 students. Most of the children are not interested in studying or preparing for the regent. The teacher is not actually educated or didn't go to college and doesn't have the degree to prepare children for their regent. The children are unruly and misbehaving after a full day of Talmud studies. And so some of the children are getting some level of preparation for their regents. My son is very interested in being prepared, and so he is pretty serious about it. And he also is getting the messaging from home that this is serious and important. Mm-hmm. But it's an uphill battle. It's super difficult, and most of the children will not be, in the teacher's own words, My son and 2 others are probably ready to take the region at the end of the year, should this have been a regular school year, but the rest of the students probably will fail.
Right. So now, can you talk a little bit briefly about what his schedule looks like during this crisis?
Right. So similarly to what Beatrice mentioned, the schools did nothing until like this week. Today actually is my son's first day of school. They have a conference line that they're supposed to be calling. There are 2 separate sessions of hour-long sessions of Talmud study and Musar, which is, how do you define Musar? Ethics, maybe?
Yes.
And so there's 2 sessions, 2 hour-long sessions in the course of the day. For me, and I see somebody asked that in the chat, so I just want to like answer that briefly. I legally don't have the right to switch my children to a different school. They need to be in Hasidic, ultra-Orthodox.
We're going to get to that. We're actually going to
talk about more. But for me, I see this as an opportunity because the children are with me all day now to give them access to other educational experiences. And so there's lots of tutors and classes that we're trying to juggle. But from the—
Let me jump in. At this moment, does your son get any secular education? Does his school offer any secular education during this crisis right now?
His school is not offering any secular education during this time.
Got it. Okay. So can we move on to Julie Kay? Can you tell us a little bit, what does it look like on the outside, whether within your own family or what public and private schools are offering during the year and now during this crisis?
Sure. Well, as always in New York, there's a real wide range of educational opportunities. So that's sort of the starting point that even in normal circumstance, there are public schools, private schools, religious schools, and New York state law doesn't require schools to subscribe to a certain curriculum, but they do have sort of a standard that says that you have to have substantial equivalent education throughout these. So if I'm running a independent private school or a religious school, I can choose curriculum, I can choose what I teach in some ways, but there has to be that kind of basic, substantially similar throughout these schools. And you have to keep kids on track and learning. And I think what we really look at when we sort of look at what these yeshivas are offering, and we are talking a lot about the ultra-Orthodox Hasidic ones, the kinds of experiences that Javi and Beatrice have had are found throughout these yeshivas, and that they just aren't giving enough secular education so that the kids are not getting beyond a decent level of literacy by the time they're in high school for the most part. And again, they don't have to do a perfect level of education, but you want people to have a GED or equivalent and ability to take the regents. And we want parents to have the kind of information around curriculum, what their kids are learning, what their priorities are, and how that's being demonstrated. And we're not seeing that coming out of the yeshivas, so that parents themselves aren't getting access to the kinds of information that you would want to know what your children are studying, how they're making progress, those kinds of things. There's a wide variation now, even during this time of the pandemic and the pause or the shut-in. Language is as varied as people's experience, but what we're seeing at sort of the top end is schools and the independent schools and schools with resources that have gone to an online platform where students are connecting with their teachers, sometimes in small group settings, having access to technologies. The City of New York is now starting to provide more technological resources for students that don't have access within their homes. And there's a real effort to keep kids on track and learning all their subjects. We're not cherry picking that this is the time when we'll have science, but we won't have English and those kinds of things. So teachers are really taking on a whole new level of learning and outreach. I think something that none of us ever expected, but the motivation is there to keep kids learning, and particularly in the kinds of literacy and math and science and intellectualism that they'll need throughout their lifetime, because the period of learning for kids is pretty short. It seems pretty long these days, I think, especially for parents, but the reality is that kids have a real part of their lives when they can learn, and it's important to use that well. And so I think we're all striving for that right now in what I've seen system-wide, and hearing about kids phoning in for an hour or two of religious studies, I think is not substantially equivalent to what the New York City public schools are doing right now, even with limited resources in some cases.
Right. Okay, so now I would like to specifically dive into the issue of divorce and custody as it relates to this issue. The reason I think this is so important is because often when people hear about the issue, they don't understand why parents in the community, especially those that are dissatisfied, why they're not simply removing their kids from the schools and placing them elsewhere. So I think it helps to shed some light when you see that even when parents want to remove their children, they hit major roadblocks, including from judges who are sworn to uphold the law. So Javi, can you tell us about how this issue played out in your custody battle?
Sure. So it's hard for me to really break this down for you because education was only one very small part of the larger battle that I was fighting with my ex-husband. I was on the defense in my custody case, and so I was just fighting to continue to be in my children's lives in a meaningful way and to actually be able to raise them as my full self. And during the course of our custody battle, which took 5 years, we had a long trial in which we talked through all the multiple issues that come up. And one of them was my son's specific needs educationally. My son has special needs. And so we spent a lot of time trying to educate the court on his needs and also on how the yeshiva is not doing a very good job of meeting those needs and providing him with an education that can actually work for him and where he can sit in a classroom with other students and be educated. What really stood out for me was how much the Hasidic community was really focused on keeping the children in a Hasidic yeshiva without any concern around whether this actually is working for the particular child. And so there was the school principal who testified on the stand and said things that were not actually true about how the education that they're providing is actually serving my son. We had such a hard time accessing records or files from the yeshiva or report cards or any kind of way to say, this is actually what he's learning, this is how it's working for him. Ultimately, the judge in my case didn't even address my son's educational needs at all. And when he provided a ruling, he only focused on which parent gets custody, where the kids are going to live, who makes the decisions, and didn't actually respond to the very specific needs that were brought up in the trial. So my son's educational needs were not addressed at all. And ultimately, my children are still expected to attend Hasidic yeshivas. As they're getting older, we're looking at new ways to support them and providing them with an education now that they have more voice and can express their needs more clearly.
Right. Okay, so Beatrice, can you tell us how this played out in your custody situation?
Yeah, so I'll go back a little bit to 2016 when I got my divorce. I had separated 2 years prior to that. And when I actually was in the Jewish court for about a year, based in for a year and a half, and then back in family court. And in family court, we ended up settling, not going to trial, settling. And as part of the settlement, I signed that I would send my children to similar kinds of schools, and I would not switch. And that was fine with me at that point. My daughter, and now we're going to jump to 2018, my daughter was struggling a lot in her school, and I switched her to a different school that was, in my mind, and I think in most people's minds, similar enough, also a Hasidic school in the Chabad environment. And that brought me back into court. My ex-husband filed that I was violating the agreement, brought me back into court. Ultimately, the judge ruled that it was okay for her to stay there. It's still an ultra-Orthodox school, that it was okay for her to stay there. I did want to switch my son as well to a similar kind of school, but I was blocked from doing that and just about had to take an oath, that I would not do that in order for that motion to be stopped. And again, I had told my children had their own lawyer, and I kind of had a conversation explaining to him, there's no secular studies, it's all very, very limited. And it's almost like they just don't want to go there. They just don't want to deal with it. I just also want to explain something that perhaps some of you know that are on here, but some of you don't know, that when you're divorcing in the community, there's a lot of pressure and a lot of fear. I was under a tremendous amount of fear of losing custody of my children. And I only have some of my children in my life. Most of them are not in my life. So it was not an unfounded fear. It was a very valid fear. So what ends up happening is, like, you just sign anything. If it grants you the minimum, you're just so, I was just so happy that, okay, at least I got custody. Like, I'll deal with the education issue. It's going to be fine. But as my older children got older, you know, I have children in their 20s and in their, officially graduated high school, but didn't actually graduate, but they're done kind of those years. And seeing the level of struggle that they have, and, you know, wanting to achieve, wanting to move ahead, but really being so held back, it really motivated me to see, like, I just don't want to leave things the way they are. I want to be able to make change either in the system or outside, which is right now my goal. How can we make changes within the system? And if not, then without the system. So that's kind of a summary of where, and now my hands are literally tied right now, you know. And as I filed this lawsuit just to change the school system, what I got in retaliation was another summons to family court, kind of using that as the basis of a next thing that I'm somehow violating something in the agreement.
Can I pause for a second? Because I think for some of the viewers, it may be confusing because you're talking about two different cases. You recently filed a lawsuit against the city and against your son's yeshiva, and you filed a lawsuit with the state saying that they're not providing a substantially equivalent education and that the city is not enforcing it. And after filing that lawsuit, you were taken back to family court to try to strip you from all custody.
Correct. And to be fair, or to be honest, not fair, honest, the school is working directly in cohorts, you know, with my ex-husband, you know. It's very clear. He has access to the paperwork immediately, you know, the way it's quoted, the way it's written. So it's really tough. So when people ask why parents don't speak up in the community, you know, there's good reason. Like, there's good reason why parents don't speak up.
Right.
You know?
So, Julie, I'll turn to you now. You've worked with several people in similar situations. So first, if you could tell us approximately how many fathers and mothers in these situations you've worked with, whether you've noticed a pattern, and specifically what I'm interested in, and I think many in the audience would be interested as well, is are there instances where the judge is explicitly aware of how bad the education is, or non-existent in some cases, and they would still say, well, too bad, leave the child in that school, or leave the child with a parent who wants to keep the kid in a school that's not meeting substantial equivalency?
Sure. You know, our work at Footsteps in this area is really looking at individual families and parents, our members who are all people who have left ultra-Orthodoxy or in the process of leaving, and they really want to maintain relationships with their children. And as I think Beatrice said very clearly, there's a lot of risk that if you leave the community, you will lose that relationship, either through a custody ruling that takes away even visitation in some cases, or through just generally as the years go on, the kind of alienation and practice. I will say that we got interested in the issue of custody, and I quickly realized that education is the most contested issue in these cases, that there are sort of two reasons that I think education is very important to our members, to people leaving ultra-Orthodoxy. The first is because they want their kids to have options. They want their children, whether they stay in the community or decide to leave, to have the ability to earn a living and to have kind of a, you know, an ability to function in a secular world on many levels. And I think on even a deeper level than that, for our member parents, they really want their children to have an intellectual life that they often themselves didn't get through their limited education. And they want to have that kind of questioning and love of a diverse range of knowledge that just doesn't come through in the ultra-Orthodox school. And then for the religious parent, the religious learning is a priority because of the religious values and because of the child's future role in the community. They want that child to really fit in and be embraced by the community, and that often doesn't happen when there are outside influences. And also because of the role that the school plays in the community. The school is really very central in bringing families in, educating children, but also in controlling the behavior that goes on at home. So when your child goes to an ultra-Orthodox school, you sign an agreement with the school to follow the school rules that dictate what goes on in the home. And I think for those of us coming from the secular world, that's really shocking to think about, that I would be told I couldn't have the internet at home because of the school where my child went, or that certain practices and religious practices. So that is really difficult for a secular parent who is, then going to be subject to having the school control what goes on in his or her house. So we end up in situations where there's very little room for compromise. There aren't, for those of us from the outside world might think, well, why don't they just go to a modern Orthodox school? Well, those schools are often not acceptable, or almost always not acceptable to the ultra-Orthodox parent, and often the secular parent, doesn't think that's a good fit. So the inflexibility that's there, both Javi and Beatrice have mentioned, as their children got older, their educational needs changed. That's really difficult when you're locked into a certain system. And in any other area, if one parent or two parents wanted a change in their education for their child, they would work through it. They would look at different options. They would meet with experts and decide what's the best fit. Here, what we're really seeing is this kind of default to what the religious priority and what the religious parent is wanting for an education for his or her child. As to your question of judges, I mean, that's tricky. Every case is different, as we say that to members, and as lawyers know and believe. I think there is a growing recognition among judges and attorneys for children, the attorneys that the judges assigned to represent the children, that the kind of secular education, the substantially equivalent education that we want for kids is not happening in a lot of these yeshivas. The work that Yaffed's been doing has raised that level of awareness. That's very different from how do we show that this individual child is not getting the education that he or she needs, and how do we present the kind of information, the curriculum, the grading, the evaluations, that it's very hard for our members to get, that kind of full and honest disclosure from the school. The school is, in every case that I've seen, is very much aligned with having the child stay in a religious setting. That's their priority. They see it as central to the child's well-being. They see it as more important, I think, than the relationship with the secular parent. And often the school is, frankly, part of the problem in alienating the secular parent through its direct teachings and through its actions towards the secular parent, or even the less religious parent. Many of our members are fairly observant Judaism, but it's not at the ultra-Orthodox level, so they're sort of not included in the community that they're once a part of.
Can I jump in on something that you just touched upon, but it really goes back to what Javi said, where when you're in court, you have no ability to get any pertinent documents, and I would think in a normal court setting, that in itself would be a red flag. What do you mean you don't have a curriculum? What do you mean you can't produce a single report card? I know some yeshivas do have report cards, usually only Jewish studies, but what do you mean you don't have a lesson plan? Something, show us something, and that in itself should raise the alarm, sound the alarm. But for some reason, even that doesn't seem to happen. I want to mention, to me, and I think to many people in the audience, it's astonishing that when this does come up in court, that a judge doesn't automatically even have an obligation to refer it to the authorities. So I recently read the following decision where a judge awarded custody to one parent, even after acknowledging in his ruling that the yeshiva this parent is sending the kid to offers little or no secular education. And here's the quote. John Doe is going to refer to the child, currently attends school Sunday through Thursday from approximately 7:30 a.m. to 5:30 p.m. and on Fridays from 7:30 a.m. to 1 p.m. The course of study at the yeshiva consists primarily of Judaic studies with 1.5 hours per day devoted to reading and math. The school does not provide many of the courses required under the New York education law. There are no regent level courses, and there was no proof adduced, I'm sorry, I don't know what that word is, at trial to show that the teachers are board certified. After 8th grade, John Doe will not receive instruction in any secular courses at his current yeshiva, and he will not attain a state-recognized high school diploma. So first of all, I guess that should be mentioned to the audience, is that 95% of Hasidic boys do not graduate with a high school diploma because they don't get a high school education. And once they reach high school, there's zero secular education. But here you have a situation where the judge clearly articulated how bad his education is, and then still awarded custody and education decision-making to the parent that is maintaining that status quo.
Right. I know that case well, and we found it shocking. What I will say is that is one of the cases where we were able to get the judge to focus on what is the child actually getting for an education. And I think that's more and more the direction that we're trying to move in representing parents, is showing, this particular child, this particular school, to put that kind of evidence up there with the hopes that the judge would have a very different reaction. I know in that case, the judge was doing what we've seen a lot of, kind of deferring to, well, this is part of the child's culture, and really treating religion almost like a third parent in these cases, so that instead of listening to the parent in that case, or in many cases, who really are talking about the kind of secular education and a value that is really unquestioned in civil society in New York City, they really looked at, well, the child fits in with the community. This is part of, where the child's coming from. We need to start being more aggressive in what's the constitutional right of the child to an education, what's the right of the parent to decide that child is going to get the education to be able to thrive in the outside world, to have both a participation in civil society and to fit that criteria. I'm optimistic that we'll do better, but we've got a long way to go. And the judges, I think, from what I've seen, see, oh, this is an ultra-Orthodox family. That's where they go. When you got married at age 18 or 19, you agreed you were going to raise this child in a certain way. The community and the ultra-Orthodox side is saying there's no flexibility. If they have any kind of outside exposure, they'll be ruined. And the judges are deferring way too much to that. They're not looking at the best interest of the child in the way that they should be, as this sort of holistic approach with many different factors. They're taking a sort of a big religious thumb on the scale. And so, I think that case is the extreme. These cases are not published, generally speaking, and they are sealed records. So it's very hard for us to show the kind of pattern and practice that we see. That said, I think when we can start really representing people strongly and taking sort of the climate change piece that Yaffed is doing by raising awareness around where these schools are failing people, and the piece that Footsteps is doing that is really looking at this one individual with a more secular parent and a religious parent, and how do they come to an agreement about how this child's going to get an adequate education, and what are we specifically looking at for curriculum, ability testing, those kinds of things that are facts and that matter.
Right. Can I ask you something? Do you know of a case where a judge, upon hearing about the abysmal education the child is receiving, decided to change the custody arrangement or the education custody arrangement based on that information?
Yeah, and I will say, when kids have documented learning disabilities and limitations, in some ways that's actually where we've had more success, because then you can show, the kid has a state, an IEP or an IESP that shows their educational plan, what they need for their specific education. And we've had some success in working with an educational consultant who's been able to really speak and read that language and find a school that's a better fit. I also think as some of these kids get older and they themselves really want and need a secular education, you're not going to go to college coming out of a yeshiva. And there are kids, especially when they're supported by a parent who has, educated him or herself after a yeshiva. A lot of our members, once they leave the community, really want an education for themselves. It's, you're balancing children and economics and everything else, but that passion for education that I think, Javi and Beatrice have both talked about is not uncommon, and it's something that really the kids adapt, and as they get older are starting to make demands themselves for education. And that's something that we want to start putting before the courts.
Right. But Javi's situation did have a special needs child, I believe, right? I'm assuming he had an IEP, and still the court didn't let you pull him out. Is that the case?
Yes, exactly. We had an IEP, which we presented to the judge, and still the courts determined that maintaining the status quo was more important.
And you wanted to switch him to another Hasidic yeshiva that happens to have a special education program in it, correct?
Right. So at that point, we brought the court's attention to Hasidic yeshivas that can provide him with supports around his IEP, or at least they had, like in the yeshiva, they had specialists coming in to provide the speech therapy, occupational therapy, a SETS provider, which his yeshiva wouldn't provide. But there was very little room for any kind of compromising or working with the other party. It was just very much, my ex-husband had a very clear vision for maintaining things exactly as they were. And all the community leaders, their pediatrician, the principal of the yeshiva, teachers, other experts that they brought from the community collaborated to say that the only school that's going to work is the one he's currently in, and there's no room for any kind of compromise.
Wow. Okay, so I would like to ask, what advice do you have for those who are just beginning this process of, I don't know, separation, getting a get, or a divorce? So just to make sure not everyone jumps at once, Beatrice, do you have any suggestions?
I wish I could say that I do. You know, it would be easy to say, don't sign anything. But you know what? Oftentimes you're signing because you're desperate and you need to sign that piece of paper. You need to sign that agreement. I honestly, at this point, I don't think there's an easy answer of what to tell parents. I guess speak to Julie Kay before you do anything, I guess. I don't know if I could have done it any different. You know, it's not like I look back and say, oh, I should have done that. I should have done that. Things would be different now. I don't. You know, I signed that agreement because I felt I had to. I felt I had no choice. So I really can't give a suggestion in terms of how to do things differently. Maybe Julie can offer more, you know, where she's at the cutting edge of working with such parents.
Right.
And hopefully things will shift in court. I mean, that's the hope, that things will shift in the court system. See, as long as things are this way in the court system, then what rights how do you maneuver through that? And also just in regards to what you mentioned before in terms of, you know, as long as the New York State and New York City education is not enforcing these rules in schools, like why should family courts enforce it? You know, so I think it's really very tricky and very complicated. So I think maybe I defer this question to somebody else.
Okay, Javi, let's hear what you have to say, if you have any suggestions.
I am right there with you, Beatrice. There really is very little parents can do. What I do tell people who reach out to me is focus on maintaining a healthy, strong, trusting relationship with your children so that they're not as easily brainwashed in the system, so that they're not turned against you, so that they still hold on to a vision for potential for a future of an education for themselves, and keep their minds open and keep them curious and feed them education whenever you can, and hold on to your own sanity because it's a long uphill battle.
Great. So Julie, if you could give us some suggestions, and as you do or after you do, if you can also tell me what you think about Beatrice's situation, where she now kind of, it may not be related, but she kind of took this separate new route where she is basically suing the city and the yeshiva to say, look, I'm not trying to take my kid out of this yeshiva. I want this same yeshiva to offer a substantially equivalent education.
Right, and I think that's a great point, Naftali, and I think to show some of the different tactics that are even on this call, that Yaffed is really working to get a better education within yeshivas. At Footsteps, we're really about people who have left the community and their individual children, and I think what Javi and Beatrice have shown is that a lot of what needs to be done is outside of court. So I, as a lawyer, have a lot of faith in court most days. But I want to really recognize the limitations and where we are. Javi mentioned the hardships that her case was. I think her case was extremely difficult and complicated. And in the end, I think the court took some very positive steps to allow her even to be herself as a parent around the child. She didn't have to pretend to be religious around her children. She didn't have to pretend to be religious. She didn't have to closet herself in many ways. But they left education decision-making solidly in the hands of her ex-husband. And that, I think, was a mistake. I think it was an attempt for the court to split the baby in half that has become more and more unworkable, and was unusual. We always say all we want is for our clients to be treated like normal custody cases. In a regular custody case, you wouldn't have this kind of heavy-handed, one-sided decision-making on these issues, and particularly in cases where there's some shared custody. So, what needs to happen next? I think, continuing in the individual cases to have an educational consultant has been a very important piece for us, trying to get some of that information, and I think a greater awareness through the kind of case that Beatrice is involved in now, that brings greater attention to the state of the yeshivas. I mean, they've done a very good job at keeping out the Department of Education and Mayor de Blasio's investigators. Who knows how hard anybody's really been trying on either end, but they have not been subject to the kind of scrutiny that needs to happen there, and the regulation that needs to happen to make sure that the government is ensuring that these kids are getting an education. And it's not just people who have left the community who want their kids to have an education. There are people who are very much a part of the community and benefit from being in that world, but they still want their kids to be taught by people who are trained and have not just sort of come up through the same system and are literate and qualified. And so I think those kinds of pieces of looking at the individual case and really trying to create better precedent, trying to have more public attention to these cases, have the decisions published, have more of a conversation around education and attorneys for the children, as well as some of the judges really looking at this issue and realizing that each family, even in the same situation of coming out of ultra-Orthodoxy, each family has a very different story and very different needs. And these cases are time consuming, they're expensive for the courts, they're really expensive for the people who are litigating them. The community often raises funds to support the person who's staying and takes care of their legal fees. I appreciate Beatrice's advertisement for us. I think Footsteps is really working hard to support our members who are in custody disputes, both with access to pro bono legal services, as well as the kind of support they need in making this transition as parents, as employees.
Can I jump in a little bit? When I asked for suggestions, Beatrice said that, she doesn't have any, and she said, she would say don't sign documents, but really, sometimes you feel. I just want to put it out there that from my conversations with people, I did find it to be helpful for people to know early on to not just sign documents. I mean, obviously, there's a difference between signing, not signing, and at least scrutinizing. You could look at the document and look closely and see, what are all the provisions. For many people, they get divorced or separated at a time where they want nothing to do with it. I just want out. So yeah, sure, sign, leave me alone. But I think it's important to tell people, look closely at it, as you said, involve an educational consultant or a lawyer. But the point is to not just sign easily and giving up rights that could later be used in court, because the courts have used those early agreements, even if they were not done in a very legal setting, they've used them to prevent people from making any changes. Another suggestion that someone made in the comments, which I also thought of, is just to recommend that people document everything. They save evidence. Again, at the moment, even bringing up the issue of education isn't so helpful, but hopefully that's changing. But if you have your children's report cards and there's no mention of any secular studies, or if you have a schedule like the one that Javi showed earlier, which shows that they're getting almost no secular education, I think it's very important to tell people to, document and save those things.
I, as a lawyer, couldn't agree more. Don't sign anything and keep, records of everything. And I will say that, the pressure is real. The pressure, a lot of people go straight to the based in because they don't know about the secular system. I think we're changing that. Footsteps is coming out with a manual next month about sort of for our members and others about things to keep in mind, and documenting is part of that, how to find lawyers, how to, kind of really show that your children have been, leading an ultra-Orthodox life, but the individuality of your family, whether they're watching Netflix or anything else. But, the other piece of it is just letting the courts know more what's happening as people are leaving, so that there's a reason that people go to the based in. And I was once told by a child psychologist, children are made of rubber, not glass. And so they are flexible, they're resilient. We'll see how they come out of the coronavirus better than some of us, I imagine. And courts need to keep that in mind and need to realize that the most harmful thing for a child is to lose a parent or to lose a relationship with a parent. And losing a religion is not at that same level. And so I think that needs to be the starting point for the judges in this case to really see, how can we do what's best for this child? And education is so central to that.
Right. No, that's such a good point. I often find it infuriating when people try to make it seem as if kids are so inflexible, and it's more important to keep them in a school that deprives them not just of an education right now, but really of a future, because oh my God, they're not going to be able to survive the shift. I've actually seen families that have managed to switch their kids into less yeshivas that are not depriving them of an education, right? So yeshivas that, or other schools that do provide a great education, and the kids thrive and love it and excel. It's really interesting. So this is going to be my last question to you all. If you had the ear of policymakers such as New York State's senators and assembly members, or New York City council members, education officials, what are some policy recommendations you would have for them? I guess, Javi, go ahead.
Oh man, this is one of those questions. It's like when I was a kid and they asked if you were president, and I was just like, what would you, what law would you enforce? And my answer would have been, stop schools from happening. And now I'm trying to be the adult who's saying the opposite. So I guess my only answer would be, education, providing children with a sound education is a basic human right, and people in power need to be enforcing that. And ensuring that yeshivas are providing an equivalent education. All children deserve that. I guess broadly, I would say that I think that the attitude that Hasidic children will remain in Hasidic communities and therefore they don't need access to a complete education is a problematic attitude, because we don't know what a child's future is going to be. Even children who remain in the Hasidic community deserve access to education so that they can ultimately provide for their families and themselves. And so just broadly to say that somebody needs to be overseeing and ensuring that all children are given access to an education.
Right. Okay, Beatrice, what are your thoughts?
I mean, the fact that we're even having this conversation talks to like the ridiculousness of this situation. The compulsory education law was passed over 100 years ago. Like, every child in New York State is required to have an education, period, end of story. The fact that there is religious education in those schools is fine. It was a decision made that it's okay to introduce religious education in those schools. So I don't even think it's a matter of policy. It's really a matter of going back to what was the original intent when compulsory education was enacted in New York State, and how do we ensure that that's actual reality, that every single child in New York State has that education. And like, if we would all know that every child has a baseline of a basic education, then we can have a conversation about, well, do we want this style or that style? But here we're ending up talking about the basic rudimentary, literacy that some children, many children, tens of thousands of children are being deprived of every single day as we sit here and speak. So that would be my thing. Just go back to what is that law and how do we make sure it actually happens?
Right. Okay, so Julie, do you have any
Yeah,
recommendations?
I think what both of them said, is the context of that I completely agree with, that there's a human right to education and there's a New York state law, and now it's about enforcing it. I mean, you know, they have not been self-monitoring themselves. It's time for, you know, some kind of standards, regulations, give us the data that we need as lawyers, but moreover as parents. And if you have one parent who wants their child to have an education and one parent who's okay with the current, you know, situation, that's when I want the judge to make the decision and look at the evidence and what do we value. And so, you know, let us have more data. Stop letting the school stonewall, you know, parents and the state from getting the kind of information that is very basic.
Right. So many people may not know, but the New York State Education Department and the Board of Regents are currently reviewing specific regulations that would make the enforcement of substantial equivalency more automatic and more efficient and effective. And the state has been dragging their feet. The Board of Regents has no appetite to actually pass it. So what we need is certainly for people, and I saw someone asking the questions, what can the public do? The public should be monitoring it and speaking up. There are always opportunities to reach out to Education Department and Board of Regents members and urge them to finally pass these regulations as soon as possible, because otherwise another school year and another school year will go by before these, before any enforcement takes place. Before we go to Q&A, I just want to give a plug to a newly formed organization. I learned of it only after we put this panel together, but I found out that two of our panelists are actually involved in the organization. So the name of the organization is called Right to Parent, and the website is righttoparent.org. And they will be helping people in similar divorce situations as Javi and Beatrice, and as Julie is involved. Obviously, on our end, we will continue both raising awareness about the issue, advocating to get the state to enforce their laws, seeking transparency on the part of the state and the city and other local districts and how they go about enforcing it, and so forth. I want to ask everyone to please follow us on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, and tell your friends to follow us and so forth. So now let's open it to some Q&A. I know some people have already submitted their questions, but if you don't mind, if you could just refresh it, send it to us again, and we'll try to address them. In the meantime, I'll scroll through and see. Julie, someone asked earlier about SIFE. I can't remember, it's, let me see, it's something about student with an interrupted education. Are you familiar at all with that?
Not offhand, that's why we work with educational experts.
Okay, so if you could look into it, because I actually recall perhaps speaking to this individual, but it seems like something that could be looked at as a possible solution. That's of course if they end up transferring them to a public school, but obviously we're talking here about a situation where the parent can't remove their kid, even to place them in another Hasidic yeshiva, but it's just something to think about.
But I can answer the question about the election of judges and whether it has an impact. I mean, I would like to think not, but yes, I do, even if not directly, because judges are elected for 14-year terms, but the political power that we encounter from the ultra-Orthodox community is enormous. And so I think having more scrutiny in the elections would be a positive thing.
Okay. If you see any other questions, all of you, if you see any other questions you want to jump into, please do. I'll just put in the website to Right to Parent, as well as our social media info.
Just somebody asked a question of about the status quo. The status quo is part of the best interest of the child standard, which under New York State case law is how judges determine custody and visitation. So status quo is one factor, but you know, who's going to foster a better relationship with the parent, the kind of avoiding alienation, providing all these different factors. And so that's part of what we're trying to reconfigure how judges look at it, to have it be more fair towards children and to include education and relationship with both parents.
To all of you, based on your understanding, do you get the sense that the broader Jewish organization is learning about the issue, warming up to it, and ready to help with funding and expertise and things like that?
I'll answer that to the best of my knowledge. I know that there are some pockets within the Jewish community who are getting engaged. I know Yaffed is doing such a good job of just getting that information out, of organizing conversations like this. And I think there is starting to be some movement in other pockets of Jewish communities. Lots of people are very invested in trying to do better with this. The reality is that people need to put their money into the organizations that are actually moving this conversation forward and making change. So, and I think that it takes experts to really navigate the court system and the Yeshiva system and really bring this information to the forefront. So the best way the larger Jewish community can support this is to support the people who are doing this work. And Yaffed being a prime example of that.
Thank you.
And I would also add to that, to support the people who are at the heart of this case. I mean, Javi and Beatrice kind of made mention to some of their personal experience, but from what I've seen, people who, when you're in the community, it can be a very warm and loving place, but once you start coloring outside the lines or going up against it, it can be really isolating, and you lose a lot of community.
Right, it's a very good point. When secular or reform or conservative or just modern Orthodox Jews, or even ultra-Orthodox Jews, who see what's right and wrong, when they see a GoFundMe or something for someone in this kind of situation, they should understand that the other side, has a charity account or something where they are raising tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars, and there needs to be some level playing field. It's funny, I actually remember a case, I think it was in London, where there was a similar situation, and the judge said that this is not fair. You have one side who's being flooded with money for the best and as many lawyers as possible as they need, and the other side is basically coming at it alone. So it's important that, you're right, both on an organizational level there should be support, as well as on an individual level. All right. Someone asked about the get situation. Maybe Beatrice, if you could jump in. How does that work? Do they make, what do they make you sign, and how much of it is binding? Has it come up in court? Have you been able to say, fine, whatever I had to do for the get is one thing, but now we're in actual court of law and that's not relevant?
It's a very interesting question, and I had a very interesting process in this. But I first want to mention to that other comment that in my case, recently, since I filed that lawsuit against the school and the Department of Education, the motions coming against me in family court have so greatly increased. So there's no question that there's been and he's hired a new lawyer, a much better lawyer. So there's no question that, there's been a lot of community funding. So that's very, very real. It's not just a myth or something, that's talked about. It's very real, and it's very impactful. There was a time I could handle the expenses, but at this point, it's just like blown up like crazy, because every motion that's filed, you have to respond to, no matter how ridiculous it is. So in regard to that, I had a very interesting situation. I had been first in family court for a couple of weeks, where I got custody of my children. And then I quickly moved to Basin, and I did a very interesting process that many people don't do, but I went through kind of a whole arbitration process in Basin that focused on the custody of my children, our financial arrangements, and they actually provided a ruling. They sent us to psychologists, they sent me to a psychiatrist, and they kind of processed that whole thing, ultimately giving custody to my ex-husband. And, I had to pay him child support. Like, anybody that knows rabbinic law knows that that's actually not a thing, but that's actually, that piece of paper was handed to me. And, my ex-husband then filed it in family court, hoping to get it signed off by the judge. I'm very grateful that the judge that saw it said, 1 second, a year and a half she was here and she had custody. How does this even make sense? So at that point, we started the process again. So they basically threw that out. It definitely influenced the judge in terms of the way he saw me. And I really had a lawyer that he really calmed me down, and he said, just keep showing up and they'll get it. They'll get who you are. But then ultimately 6 months later, I signed a settlement that was signed off by the judge. And that's when part of what I signed off there is that I would send them to similar schools. I don't know if it would be different if I would have gone through the entire court process. Like, I don't know. There's no way to say that based on what I hear from other people's experiences. I don't know if it would have been any different. I was not under pressure to sign anything for my specific get. They actually had told my ex-husband at that point, give her a get and then we'll make sure that you get everything you want. So that was kind of like they're behind my back. They were doing that. But I like for my get, that was not a difficult part of my process at all. That was probably the easiest part of the whole process. So that's what I can talk about my personal experience. But I know others, you know, have very different experiences.
Yeah, I mean, just to clarify, but I think that is the case entirely. It's the going into the base din, whether for the get or to resolve other pieces of the divorce, I think could in some ways be helpful for, it's quicker, it's whatever, it's more of a mediation format, except for the major exception, or that really makes it not a forum for our members or for people who are leaving ultra-Orthodoxy, is that the religious courts will always put religion first. So it's very difficult for our members to get a fair forum, especially around child custody issues. And I just want to clarify one more thing. When we're talking about the courts, the vast majority of these cases are either in Brooklyn Supreme or Family Court or in Rockland Supreme or Family Court because of where the parties live. Those are the courts that hear these cases. And so, you know, how Manhattan and other jurisdictions do, we don't really know because it's not the right forum for our members, unfortunately.
Right. So you're saying that there's a requirement that they have to file in their local jurisdiction, and those jurisdictions have judges who are elected locally.
Right, and are more familiar with in some ways and also more deferential to the community. I mean, I think part of the reason, going back to even sort of why, you know, there isn't maybe more attention to this issue. I live in Brooklyn. I'm sort of 2 miles from Borough Park. Until about 4 years ago, I just sort of was like, who are those people? I don't know much about them. So the isolationism of the community has also meant that they have not been on the radar screen in a lot of ways that they should. And I think, you know, the New York City school system has a lot of problems. And certainly there are a lot of places where kids aren't getting the education they should. You know, this group, I think, has been overlooked because it's like, oh, that's what they want. They're over there. That's what they do. And now I think we're getting voices coming up and saying, you know, even people in the community don't want that level of education at low level.
Right. Javi's raising her hand.
If I may, I think I would like to answer like several of the questions that popped up and kind of from like with a broader perspective. Someone asked about how does the Beis Din impact what happens in secular court. Someone asked a specific question about my case. Did my sexuality or my choice of partner at the time impact the way the judge looked at my case? And more broadly, like why are the lawyers educated enough, even the lawyers that are holding the members? You know, do people really understand the issues? And I'll say that my general understanding of how this works is nobody, not the lawyers, not the judges, not the court, wants to start up with an entire community. So everybody just wants to take this specific person and these specific children and try to support them through this custody issue, but they don't want to make big, broad generalizations about, oh, this is how we approach Hasidic children's education in family court. No lawyer wants to take that on, and no judge wants to make some ruling that's now going to be put up against an entire community. And same with a person's sexuality or anything like that. So I think that what happens is when you come into court, the judges already and the lawyers already, they're all just want to, hush things down very quickly, not make any big waves, and try to get people to just resolve things as smoothly as possible. So in my case, I had an agreement that was signed in the Beis Din. And so that was used as an excuse kind of to say, we already have this document, this agreement is valid, you went against this agreement, and that's what we're going to use as a foundation for the rest of the case. And I think that, yes, sometimes a judge, people might get more nitty gritty and nitpick and pull apart pieces of it and make a specialized agreement or order based on the individual people involved. But broadly, people are just trying to take whatever evidence exists before them or whatever tools that they already have in their hands to kind of placate the parties in front of them and get things to quiet down so as not to make some big statement against an entire community, against an entire educational system, things like that. And so that's just been my experience broadly. I don't know if that's helpful.
I want to quickly answer a question that's been asked by at least one person, but probably many people are thinking it or don't even think to think. In ultra-Orthodox yeshivas and in non-public schools in general, you don't need, the law unfortunately doesn't require certified teachers. Granted, most private schools would aim for the top, right? They're going to look for the most certified teachers. In ultra-Orthodox yeshivas, but specifically in Hasidic yeshivas, there are hardly any certified teachers. In fact, there are hardly any competent teachers, as Beatrice had mentioned. Many of them are just like the Jewish studies teachers, but they want a second income, or because in the past when they used to hire public school teachers for the 90 minutes, the kids were disrespectful to them. So the yeshiva started hiring ultra-Orthodox teachers so that the kids are more respectful. And so now you have people who themselves don't really know English or math, let alone any other subjects, which they don't even bother teaching. So again, just the answer is teachers unfortunately are not required to be certified. And I guess going back to what policymakers should do is they should consider having this requirement across the board. Unfortunately, they need to be competent, but competent is such a subjective measure, although we can all agree that in many cases, it's very clear that they're not even competent. Okay.
If I can just get a little personal, I don't know if this question was asked. And I think it goes back to questions that I've heard in the past is why don't more parents speak up? If this is such an issue, why don't more parents speak up? And under the sink. So we're all at home with kids now, right? Why don't more parents speak up? And, like one of the concerns I had when I filed this lawsuit back in September was, how would it impact me personally? What would it be for me? I live in the community. I shop in the community. At that point, I've worked in the community. And unfortunately, I lost my job a couple of weeks ago, and ostensibly the reason was because of, COVID-19, etc. But I mean, everything indicates my department that I worked in within, a clinic within the organization was extremely profitable, extremely successful. And, I definitely believe that I was an easy target because of this, because I spoke up. And the way the organizations are all intertwined, even something as a medical clinic is associated very closely with other political organizations within the communities that are actually fighting against, are actually working against any improvements in education. And it's kind of, I guess because I've been through so much these past couple of years, it was something I knew that may happen. Obviously, it's challenging at this point with, all the emotions coming in, meaning to deal with this. But it's a very real reality of what happens. And I think Julie can probably talk to this. You've probably seen this in a bigger picture of the consequences of speaking up and the consequences of trying to make change within the community. Yeah.
Are you saying that other people in other employees in your department remained in place and that they only selected you?
Again, it's very hard, and I think I'm not the only one that's talking about this. It's very hard because of the COVID, right? And because, of the impact financially it has on so many institutions, it's hard to kind of prove it, right? But I will say this, my department has always been extremely profitable, continues to be extremely profitable. And yes, my assistant and everybody else within the organization, Hasidic men who were in my department, all still employed, all still have their positions. So it's, yeah, it's a very real reality of the consequences.
Like possibly what, while while your ex and his partners are dropping more and more motions on you in court, you're also being starved out of an income.
And I mean, I think Beatrice, your comments say it so well about the toll that this takes on people. And it's the hardest thing about these cases because there are children involved, there are parental relationships. I mean, do I want everybody to have every single constitutional right they're entitled to? Of course. But, you know, I can't say to a client, you keep fighting, keep fighting. We always say, put your family first. And if you make compromises because you want to not be in court forever, you don't want your children to go through testing just to prove what they don't know. It's the biggest struggle, I think, individually because of the parent and child relationship and because children are children and are vulnerable. And, you know, the parents that I've met through this work have had an incredible devotion to their children's well-being. And I think that's the hardest part in court is being told, you know, you're not in charge of your child's well-being or you're not doing everything that you can. And I've seen the opposite, and really parents who want their children to continue to have a strong and loving relationship with their religious parent as well. So I have nothing but admiration for that, and it's going to take a while. So.
Okay. Thank you so much, everyone. I just want to once again mention to the audience, please visit us at www.yaffed.org, as well as on Facebook, Twitter. You know, on Twitter actually is where the opposition is very vocal and constantly attacks, and the media and politicians are more active on that media platform. So if you can join us over there and make your voice heard in favor of children, tens of thousands of children who are being denied an education, that would be very helpful. And keep following the work. And whenever there's an opportunity to reach out to elected officials and education officials, please don't hesitate and invite all your friends. We're also going to do future panels on related topics, and we hope that you will join us and invite all your friends. Okay, thank you so much. And thank you to all the panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great, bye.
Bye.